I did have another email. We can jump into this discussion. I did have another email that I've tried to find and couldn't find the exact email, so I've lost the name. But the gist of the question was, is a moderately long-term listener, not from the start, but he's been listening for a while. But he's heard me talk about the amounts of cash that could be generated in wrestling back in the territory days. But he also knows that he's heard us talk about guys getting checks or what their check was. He's seen my paycheck stubs, some of them that were reprinted in the Midnight Express scrapbook. And he was just wondering, so what's the deal? The cash, the checks, how did guys get paid? Did it differ from territory to territory? And what's the daggum deal? Would you like me to extrapolate on that, Mr. Last?
Please extrapolate.
Well, I'll be glad to extrapolate.
I'll be glad to listen.
Wrestling has always involved a lot of cash in various transactions. Not all of it, and most of it didn't benefit the boys. Most of that benefited the promoters. Because we've mentioned that, especially in the territories and especially in spot shows in high school gyms or, local facilities, rec centers that you would go to in small towns, not the major arenas in your territory, people didn't buy. I guarantee you there wasn't a credit card machine or any way to use a credit card, not only in any of the spot shows that Christine Jarrett ran around southern Indiana and Kentucky, but probably even at the Evansville Coliseum itself. They had a ticket booth with a lot of dollar bills for change, and the tickets were $5 and $6, right? So the promoters benefited a lot from the amount of cash that these shows every night of the week, every week of the month that they ran year in, year out could generate. But that's not where the boys made out with their with their cash payoffs. A lot of times in the territories, guys would get cash in form of draws. We've talked about those before. A draw, they didn't do draws in Tennessee. I'd never heard what the fuck they were until we went to Louisiana. Because Jerry Jarrett and them knew that a guy that was working for them on Tuesday night, they might never see him again after that. He might not be there on Wednesday night. So they weren't going to give him a fucking draw against the money he was earning that week. Except if Lawler or Dundee or Handsome Jimmy Valiant or at the time Austin Idol or whatever, if they needed $1,000 to buy a car or whatever, yeah, here. But for the most part, no. But where the cash payoffs came in a lot to the boys, and Brian, you can probably suggest a couple of other towns, but they were the standalone towns where the promoter, like Sam Muchnick in St. Louis, Paul Bosch in Houston, when they were not necessarily affiliated with a full territory, and they would get some of their talent from other booking offices, and they would fly in some of the guys, they were noted for paying in cash. And that didn't always go for Paul Bosch because obviously, especially after he became partners with Watts, it was paid through the Mid-South office. But the stories are out there with Sam Muchnick's payoffs. Dick the Bruiser said one time if he was supposed to get $537.23 for a St. Louis show, that he would get an envelope with not only the cash, but also the 2 dimes and 3 pennies in it, right? And it would jingle.
Yeah, Muchnick didn't round up or down.
Yeah, no, he did he was probably the only one. And other times, before the territories formed full-fledged, the 50s, and it even lasted into the 60s, if a local promoter, large or small, ran a town and he booked guys from another booking office that was running a full-time territory, a lot of times those guys would get paid in cash because it was not considered, a regular town for that booking office they were working for. And there were all kinds of those deals in the old days before the territories got modern and had formed kind of, habits and taken over everything. There were still those town promoters. And then in the modern era, it came back to cash when the independents started. Because before that, like I said, when the territories got formed, then everybody started getting paid pretty much by a check for a week, or some places 2 weeks, most time a week. And that lasted pretty much everywhere, because now the territories are legitimate businesses. They got to pay taxes, where they're, believe me, they're not paying the boys and not reporting a business expense like that to the government. They're just taking in money and not reporting that income to the government. They reported every expense they could. And that's where the guys started getting in trouble with the IRS, because they were not good at paying their income tax. And now all of a sudden, they're getting stooged on by the promoters. They're being turned in effect, just by the promoters doing what they're supposed to do. And then when the independents came in, is where I was going with the close of that. That's where guys started getting paid in cash again. But this time, and I can tell you, I mean, the statute of limitations has somewhat run out, and I'm pretty anal with my reporting anyway. But yes, a lot of wrestlers on these independents that sprung up in the 90s, if they're getting paid $500 or $300 or $1,000 or whatever the dollars are, do you think they're going to, and they know they're not going to get a 1099 from that person, that person is operating under the radar at the fucking Roller-Rama, and most of the people in the town don't even know that show's going on, much less the government on somebody's tax return. So they're taking that cash, and wherever it goes, it goes. That, again, it came back to like it was in wrestling to some extent in the 30s, 40s, 50s, before the territories. So we kind of came full circle. But I thought of a story, actually, when I was thinking about this, how people got paid in different territories. This is one I've never told before. I know people are going to say, oh, my God, a new one, but I hadn't thought of it in years. But when we first went to Mid-South Wrestling, me and Bobby Eaton, Dennis Condrey, okay, the way you got paid in Mid-South for Watts was on Wednesdays at Shreveport, the television station, where we did local promos during the day from 9 o'clock until 3 o'clock, along with the TV formats and your booking sheet and copies of any memo that Bill Watts wanted to give out to the boys on what to do, what not to do, was your check. And what Watts would do was he would hold a week back. In other words, most territories, I'd come from Memphis. If the Memphis week started on a Saturday and ended on a Friday, and you got paid for the Saturday through the Friday, on the following Monday at the Mid-South Coliseum, they'd hand you your check. Did I explain that fairly succinctly, Brian?
I think so.
Okay, but Watts would hold back a week, because he knew from experience, especially in that territory, and the guys would crack up. Sometimes guys would have been staying in a hotel and leave a hotel bill. Or sometimes guys would fuck something up or do something to get some heat on them and take off and no show. And to prevent that happening, to have a little bit more leverage, Watts would hold a week back. So you would get paid for that Saturday through Friday that I just talked about 10 days after that Friday was over with, in the middle of the week on the Wednesday at interviews. He always had a week of your money. So if you just decided to say, fuck it and leave, well, if you didn't show up to pick up your check, you weren't getting that fucking money, right? So you had a little investment in not leaving any unpaid bills in the territory and giving a proper notice, and then you'd get all of your money up to the last day you worked. So that's what he did. But at interviews, Brian, you remember there's a couple of local promos still floating around out there where Bobby and Dennis are standing behind me. right when we first got there. And then you don't ever see them, except they came to be on camera for some of the Last Stampede promos when Watts came out of retirement. But what happened was, at first, all the top heels and all the top baby faces were supposed to show up at promos. And obviously the incentive to get there was that's when you got paid every week. But Bobby and Dennis came for the first week or maybe two. And then Watts and everybody else saw and realized they weren't going to say anything. I did. And it's not like we had 5-minute interviews. These were the 2-minute or less local promos. And that was the thing. I did the talking. They just stood there and made mean faces. So Watts said, it would keep them more special if we didn't see them until they were in the ring for the match. So so Bobby and Dennis actually had heat with everybody else in the territory at first because they were the only top guys that didn't have to come to promos, because I was handling that part. That was part of the deal. And I would just pick up their checks and bring them to them. But the first week we're there, we see the checks laid out and everything. Okay, boom, boom. And I think it was Crusher Darso, Barry Darso. But Nikolai Volkov was there, Butch Reed was there. Could have been anybody. Said, do you guys know where the bank is? What? With the bank where we cash our checks. Oh, no. Oh, well, you can follow us over. Okay. So when we're finished with promos, before we go to the TV taping, we follow Darso and Butch Reed. And I think Buddy was probably there by the Landell. Maybe he came in, but whatever. Everybody, all the heels went over to this bank and cashed their checks. And I guess I told Bobby and Dennis, I guess this is what they do here. Okay. So we went and cashed our check. And then we're carrying it. It was our first week, and it was like $1,000. It wasn't that much money. But the guys on top had checks for a couple grand. So then the next week, again, Darso said, hey, are you going to follow us over to the bank? I said, well, let me ask you, why do they want us to cash these checks right as soon as we get them and here in Shreveport and be carrying all this cash around on us? And he looked at me like I had turds hanging out of my mouth. And he said, well, we just always, apparently, and I think Nikolai chimed in too, they had just gotten a habit because they had been making no money previously, whatever. So when the checks got big or they started working for Watts or whatever, and they started getting these big checks, they just ran to the bank as quickly as they could and cashed them while they were still good. And I said, this is Mid-South fucking wrestling. It's not like they're teetering on the precipice. And my thing was, we didn't get draws on the road because we don't want to waste the cash. And we didn't cash the checks. We took them home and put them in our own bank account. But some of these guys were just to have the cash and carry it around. I was like, fuck, especially some of the places we were going. People wanted to have a personal word with me in the Midnight Express to begin with, without us carrying thousands of dollars in cash around at 3:00 in the morning. But now there have been also big cash payoffs in the modern era that we've talked about. Jake in Mexico, and what was that, 1994, while he was working for me in Knoxville for much less money. He got 25 grand in a box or whatever for shaving his head in Mexico, and had to take his own bag man to sit in a car, lock himself in with the money while Jake had his head shaved.
Was that Dallas Page?
No, remember it was, God damn it. Help me. What was his name? Scott Studd? Was that him? Or Scotty Riggs? I think it was him.
He's a Georgia guy. Makes some sense.
Yeah. Yeah, he went there specifically. Jake got him booked on the show and traveled with Jake specifically so he could hold the fucking cash in their rental car with the doors locked while Jake had the match, got his head shaved. And then Jake ran to the rental car in the parking lot, and they jumped in it and drove to the airport and spent all night in the airport at the gate so that they were in public and nobody could repossess that money.
Jake's a paranoid guy, but I don't blame him one bit for that one.
That's what anybody would have done.
Yeah.
I mean, in that situation, because So that's, that's kind of the thing is the territories, guys got paid by check most of the time. I've explained the difference. When it was a standalone town and there were always individual deals made, but that's the thing is it just depended on the individual territory as to whether they gave guys draws. I mean, when WCW took over from Crockett, that's the thing, that Chip Burnham was this guy they hired to work in the office and do settlement at the box office and everything. And he had never been around wrestling, and he was a nice guy, but he was just so thrilled to be in this wild, glamorous show business when he's like an accountant. And he would come in, everybody be sitting there fucking miserable with their head down because either there was nobody in the building or we were all working for TBS. So we were all miserable. And he'd come in with the biggest smile on his face. Anybody want to draw? Because he got to give out the money to the boys, and they'd take it because it was in front of them. But I never get, because then you're carrying cash around you're going to spend, and your check is going to be smaller. If you realize you're going to San Antonio for 3 days or whatever, take enough money at the start, use your credit card, whatever the fuck. But anyway, from the start of wrestling, the financial situation after the days of the 30s, when the world champion, whoever it may be, held all the pull, and whatever promoter controlled him held all the pull, it was always set up to where the promoters got first count, and the promoters got the benefit of any shady business that was going on, under the table or in cash transactions. But the boys got away with a lot before the territories became full-time businesses and were giving out 1099s and shit. And then the boys couldn't get away with anything. But I mean, the amount of money was still ridiculous. And if you did your bookkeeping and paid your income tax, I mean, I've told the story about that time I saw Lawler's check in Memphis. And the way we were paid in Memphis, I said, was on Monday in the Coliseum. They'd hand you your check. But this was in Louisville, because it was through Christmas and New Year's of 82, 83. And they ran Louisville on a Monday night. And Lawler's handed everybody's check out from his little room that he used in the gardens downstairs. You go down the stairs, turn right, and that was his private office and everything. And I walk in there and he hands me my check, and it was like $575 for a week, right? This was December 82, January 83. That would work out today on our handy inflation calculator to about $1,700. And I was the absolute lowest paid guy in the territory. And so he hands me my check, and as I'm standing there, his check is laying there on the fucking counter, bigger than Christmas, 3 feet from me, as he's handing, me mine. And I look and he sees me see it. Sort of like when the fucking NBC executive caught George Costanza staring at his daughter's cleavage on Seinfeld. And I'll never forget what he said. He said, if you stay in the business long enough, Jim, one of these days you'll have a check like that. Because he's being a smart ass. But I said, is that for 1 week? It was for one night. That was the Christmas week show of 82 in Memphis, where Lawler and Bockwinkel were the main event, and they sold out and did a $39,000 house. And he got 10%.
Did the percentage he got in Memphis change at all after he finally got the deal he was supposed to get from Jarrett in 83?
I do not know, because I didn't see any more of Jerry's checks, but one would think that depending on the pull that he had, and I mean, everybody knows how important he was, but to Memphis, but he had that deal for a while. He got 10% of the house in Memphis. Then in 83, he became 50% partners in the company. So think about this. For example, when me and the Midnight Express worked with Bill Watts and Junkyard Dog in the Superdome, allegedly, everybody in that match should have got paid the same thing, because we were in the main event. It was a 5-way match. So me and the Midnight got $2,000 apiece. Now, one would say, well, I bet he gave Junkyard Dog more, and I would suspect that, except by that point, Dog was so out of shape and hadn't been getting a lot of sleep and really did not hold up his part of that match, and Watts wasn't happy about it. So he probably got $2,000 also. Did Watts give himself $2,000? Well, some people would say, well, he probably paid himself whatever he wanted. But here's the thing. Watts was entitled as owner of the company, and I've got a couple of canceled checks that Jerry Jarrett did the same thing for himself. Watts paid himself in that match as talent and had to report that on his personal income. But at the same time, since he's the owner of the company, it was a business expense that he was writing off of Mid-South Sports. So it probably worked out. But again, if 5 guys made a total of $10,000 just for that one show, and there was another 20-something people on the show, and then you times that by 7 shows that ran that week, he's paying out a significant amount in payroll. And that's, with Lawler, I mentioned that $3,900, which, by the way, is almost $12,000 today for one night, 10 miles from his house, by the way. That's the kind of thing that they were doing. I mean, that was a big house. That was a sellout, but every week in Memphis was $20,000. So it's, that's a ridiculous amount of money for guys that were either figured in as top guys or own part of the office or are instrumental to the operation, as they say.
How many guys back in the territory days that you know of, because it probably almost definitely happened that you wouldn't know of, other than the wig-wearing guy in East Tennessee, how many guys got in trouble with the IRS during these years?
Oh,
because of just it being a pure cash business and every promoter skimming.
You didn't often hear about, well, let's put it this way. If the promoters had problems with the IRS, they could probably usually settle them fairly quickly because they had money. You'd hear with guys having problems with the IRS. I'm not going to mention anybody's name, although this is not like this is a secret. Ric Flair if he hadn't talked about it, other people have talked about it plenty. Crockett paid his taxes one time. I think Vince paid his taxes one time. There was a guy on WrestleMania 96 that when the payoffs for that show were being discussed, Bruce Pritchard brought up that the guy was having stressful troubles on his mind because he owed the IRS like $70,000 or whatever. And so Vince said, all right, make his pay off $100,000. That way he can pay the IRS, pay the tax on this, and he can do something positive, and boom, he's out of trouble. That's just the way Vince would think. He wouldn't do any mathematical formula. He'd say, okay, we'll take out a spot on the card, had a good match. Yeah, we don't need him worrying about that. Give him $100,000. And that's the way a lot of the promoters did it back then. But further to your question, I've known personally a bunch of people, wrestlers that had issues with the IRS because usually it wasn't malicious. It was just not being a grown up and doing it. And then I know one guy that was so scared of them that when they sent him a letter saying you owe us money, he never got an accountant and he never questioned it. He just sent him a check every time he could send him a check. And finally I had to say, wait a minute, how are you going to, you don't know what else you owe them or what you're going to come up with. You need somebody to intervene in this. But most guys didn't keep their records. They, blew a lot of cash, taking draws. So it was real easy. And there was the story. I was not obviously involved in going to Japan and back in the 70s and early 80s. But I've heard this story from multiple sources that Greg Valentine's whatever wife he had at the time, whoever he was married to at the time, they either had trouble or split up, and she's the one
Julie.
who's
Julie.
okay.
Valentine.
Well, you know her personally then. Well, I think she was on TV for Tuesday Night Titans in the early '80s, a time or two.
Yeah.
But they broke up or whatever, and she stooged on Greg and by extension, a bunch of the guys about the money they were bringing back from Japan in cash. They would get paid for their Japanese tours by Baba or Inoki and this was when top guys were making, $5, $6, $7, $8 a week, and they'd be over there sometimes for a month. So 20, 30 grand on their person. It was a simpler time back then, flying too. You didn't get searched and patted down and anal probed, when you got on the plane. So that came to an end, and certain people got in trouble for this. So yeah, that's why I always taught the guys in OVW. The first thing we'd tell them is, hey, pay your taxes, get an accountant. You may not have made money before, and you may not be making money now, but if you succeed in where you're wanting to go, you will, and you need to be prepared. And we had guys come in. I actually had one of my accountants come in and talk one time, and we gave out a lot of written information, and that was part of the talk in writing your finishes down in your book, your date book, which not only should include your match and your finish and your spot on the card and what you were paid, but your expenses and your travel information and everything for the taxes you're going to be paying. And I guess now in these days, guys are more with it. You don't hear about, you hear more about GoFundMe's for in-ring related injuries than guys needing money to pay the IRS. Whereas before there were no major in-ring injuries. It just guys were broke because they didn't pay their taxes.
Well, Jim, perhaps if they didn't pay their taxes, they may want to just close their eyes and go to sleep.
Well,
perhaps.
Well, tell them, Hawk. Well, yes, and that's exactly, and I'll tell you what, it's never been easier to do that. And we're going to tell you a lot about it today on the program, folks, how you can get better sleep. Did you know that poor sleep, Brian, can cause weight gain, mood issues, poor mental health, and lower productivity? If you sleep less than 6 to 7 hours a night, you can reduce your white blood cell count. And if your white blood cell count is reduced, then you can't fight off the illnesses and diseases and viruses and bacteria that are all around us. So the best thing to do is try to sleep as much as possible, because when you wake up, maybe by then the world will be a better place. And if you have trouble going to sleep or sleeping through the night, you need a little assistance. You don't want to do this the pharmaceutical route. You do not want to do that. No, folks, what you want is natural, sleep-promoting premium ingredients that have been triple lab tested with no THC. Well, you might want the THC, but this doesn't have any. But nevertheless, it's Beam. Beam and their Dream Powder, the best-selling healthy hot cocoa that makes everybody drop over like a rock. As soon as you sip this, folks, boom, you don't know where you are, what's going on. You're in blissful slumberland. 98% of people surveyed fall asleep faster when taking Beam Dream, and 99% of people experience better sleep quality, and that 1% of people had to be woken up by an EMT standing over them, slapping them.
No, that is not true. Let's not put fake statistics out there. That one right there was for entertainment purposes. There is no 1% that needs to be revived by EMTs.
I keep hearing about these 1%ers we can't trust. Well, folks, if you just mix Beam Dream into hot water or milk, I prefer the milk. The hot water, well, but stir and enjoy it before bedtime. What's your bedtime? It just depends. If you're a minor, if you're under the age of 4, get parents' permission before stirring this into milk. Also, you can find out why Forbes and the New York Times are all talking about Beam Why it's trusted by the world's top athletes. All you got to do is go to shopbeam.com. That's SHOPBEAM. That's the way you spell beam, just like Beam Dreams. See? Beam. Shopbeam.com/JCE. Use the code JCE at checkout. You're going to get $20 off for a limited time only, but it's worth it. You will sleep. You will wake up refreshed. You will have no side effects. You will have, as a matter of fact, there are a lot of things that keep you up at night, Brian. If your noisy neighbors or your partner wakes you up. I used to have noisy neighbors. The last time I lived in an apartment, the screaming and the yelling and the wild sexual perversion that was going on. Thankfully, this woman's husband came home about 11 o'clock every night and put an end to it. But I'll tell you what, it was rough trying to get some, but with Beam's Dream, you will sleep like a baby.
I'll tell you what,
You'll
it was
wake
rough.
up every hour crying and pissing the bed. Nevertheless, again, go to shopbeam.com/JCE, use the code JCE at checkout, and have blissful slumber for the rest of your days.